Isaiah 45:7 says, God created evil. Revelation 4 verse 11 says, for the pleasure of God, all things were created. Does this mean God took pleasure in creating evil? Welcome to the Random Village. I am the Random Villager. In the last episode, we looked at God's dealings with mankind as it pertains to his punishment of mankind and how he broad brushes this punishment on the innocent children and upon the innocent animals. Today, we will be looking at God's dealings with mankind as it pertains to God's actions in the book of Samuel with a man named Uzzah. We'll be looking at God's dealings with mankind through what God did with Elisha and the 42 children. We will also be looking at God's interactions with mankind as it pertains to what God did with Joshua and commanding the Israelites to wipe out a whole bunch of people. Now, in the book of 2 Samuel 6 verse 7, it says, God's anger rose against Uzzah, and God struck Uzzah dead. How did Uzzah end up in this situation where the Bible has it that because of his error was why God was angry with him and struck him dead? When you check the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel 4 verses 1 to 22, you'll see that it describes a story where the Philistines defeated the Israelites in battle and took the Ark of the Covenant as the spoils of war. However, while the Philistines had this Ark of the Covenant, they started getting sick and having boils and all sorts of sores and tumors coming up on their skins. So they sent it back. So it was left at a man named Abinadab's house. He was an Israelite and he had sons and daughters. One of his sons is Uzzah, the guy who was killed by God. Now, while it was with Uzzah for some 20 years in a land far away from David's kingdom, David sent for the ark. Now, according to 2 Samuel 6, while they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the animal that was pulling the cart stumbled, the cart wobbled, and Uzzah reached out his hand and grabbed hold of the Ark of the Covenant. It proceeded to say God's anger rose against Uzzah and God struck him dead because of his error. Can someone explain to me what was Uzzah's error? How did Uzzah err in trying to protect a precious artifact that belonged to these people? I mean, even in our modern day times, when an item is shipped, the shippers try to take as much care as possible to not break or damage the item in any way, shape or form. The same thing is what Uzzah is doing here. How can you be angry with someone for trying to protect the packaging? Maybe you could argue it that, hey, if he had strapped it down properly on the cart, then that wouldn't have happened. But we don't know. Point is, God struck him dead because of his error. What error? Right? So please, let me know in the comments, what was Uzzah's error there? The next case is Elisha. Now, if you know the story of Elisha, you will know that he started carrying on the work of Elijah, who was taken up in the chariot of flames. What I would like to know here though is, why is God so quick to kill and destroy? If God is good, kind, forgiving and thoughtful, How did he miss the opportunity to demonstrate this in the story with Elisha in 2 Kings 2:23-24? In this story, Elisha was on his way to Bethel. On the way, he had an encounter with some children. The children began teasing Elisha because of his baldness. Children and their ways. Elisha, as an elder, should have had the wisdom to tell the children that they were going to get old and bald one day too. So what I don't understand is, how did Elisha miss the opportunity to preach to these children and teach them to respect their elders? It's a golden opportunity right there. How did he miss it? Why didn't he take this? Instead, we see where Elisha took the route that demonstrates the total opposite of a man who is supposed to be enlightened by some all-knowing, kind and forgiving God. The decision that Elisha made, God agreed with it when Elisha cursed the children. And how did God agree with this cursing? Well, God sent 2 she-bears that ripped apart 42 of these children that were out there teasing Elisha because of his baldness. Now, I know that there are people who are going to say, I am taking these verses out of context. What I would like you to explain to me is, in what context is it okay for God to kill your child or your children or your grandchildren if you have any? Please, let me know in the comments how this is okay, how I am taking it out of context when it says God killed the children by sending the 2 she-bears that slaughtered 42 of them. Someone needs to explain that for me. How does this point to God's kindness, love, forgiving and tender mercies that the believers like to say represents God? Because so far, based on what I am seeing, these actions do not demonstrate any of those words that these Christians are using. As far as I am concerned, it's just words. Now, the next case that we'll be looking at here is God being on the battlefield. In the book of Joshua, chapter 10, verses 1 through to 15, once again, we have a battlefield description. My question is, why does God love bloodshed so much? In the book of Deuteronomy 20:16-18, God declared that the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites are to be utterly destroyed. Why? All of this death and destruction just so that the Israelites can have a promised land? Really? Why didn't God guide them to a place that was uninhabited by anyone else to have as their own piece of paradise? Why didn't God use his almighty power and erect a new piece of land somewhere out in the wide span of the ocean and put the Israelites there? Why did God have to send them on a campaign of death and destruction, wiping out a whole bunch of people who had already lived and worked the land that they're being killed for? Their grandparents worked this land, their grandparents' grandparents worked this land, and now a bunch of people just come through and wipe out everybody, sanctioned by God? Really? And that is the kind and loving God? Now, as bad as commanding the destruction of these peoples may sound, it gets even worse. In the book of Joshua 10:1-15, it describes the Amorite army being defeated by God and to some extent the Israelite army. In the passages, especially in verse 11, it showed that God killed more Amorite soldiers than the Israelite army did. What kind of loving God is this? Now, how can it get any worse, you might be wondering? In verse 12, Joshua called out to God, asking God to stop the sun in the sky so that the sun doesn't set. That way they have more daylight to continue the killing. Why didn't the loving, merciful, kind and just God say to Joshua, "No, my son, let us bring the violence to an end. Let us stop the killing for today"? No, God didn't do that. Know why? Because this is what he commanded. God wanted the utter destruction of a bunch of people in order to acquire their lands. Now, you might be saying to me, why are you just dredging up things from the Old Testament? Jesus came and he gave a new covenant and changed all of that. Remember, Jesus is just like his Father. Because in the Bible, it will tell you that Jesus came upon a fig tree that was out of season. And what did Jesus do? Instead of using his almighty powers that he used to multiply the bread and fish, the same powers that he used to resurrect, what's his name? We're going to get to that when we start covering Jesus. From the grave, Lazarus, that guy, when he resurrected Lazarus, the same powers that he used to do all these things, to heal the blind and the leper and all of these people, why didn't he use this same power to overly, abundantly bless the fig tree so that it produced so much fig out of season that the fruits probably even start breaking off the branches? Why didn't he do that? Instead, Jesus, just like his Father, is quick to kill the innocent. Jesus cursed the fig tree and it died. So, explain to me, in what context is it good or is it okay for a loving, merciful God or son of such loving, merciful God to just go around and kill any and everything as it feels like? Why does God love killing so much? Why is it that God does not have non-violent ways to solve problems? Believers like to give thanks to God when good things happen in their favor. Is this the same God that you believe in and give praises to? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening and keep reading.